A disgraced cowboy and a paralyzed woman, both broken, both discarded. And when ruthless outlaws think they can break them, they'll soon learn they've made a grave mistake. Together, this unlikely duo is about to show the frontier what it means to fight back. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the dust of the earth and the scent of hard, sun-baked soil. It was a raw, unforgiving landscape, one that made men and women alike bow to its will or break beneath it. And on this particular morning, Caleb McKnight felt himself bending to the world, just like every other man who had ever tried to carve a life out of these relentless hills. He stood by his horse, hands resting on the saddle, his broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his own thoughts. The sky above was a low, bruised expanse, clouds moving like bruised knuckles, and for a moment, Caleb thought he could hear his own heart beating in time with the gusting winds. This life had been his choice once, freedom on the open range, untamed and unbound, drifting from town to town. He'd been a cowboy, known and respected in the small communities he passed through. He was a man of his word, a man whose reputation could mean the difference between life and death for someone trying to survive the unforgiving frontier. But now, the man he once was seemed a faraway memory, a distant dream that belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. The past year had been a relentless string of betrayals, each one worse than the last. He had been forced to leave a job that had once meant everything to him, after his trust had been shattered by men he'd once called friends. His reputation had been destroyed, his name spoken with scorn and suspicion. The man who had been the pride of the ranching community was now just a shadow of that man, a man whose past was as stained and damaged as the worn boots he wore. He hadn't asked for this life. And then, out of nowhere, the letter had come. Caleb McKnight, you are hereby requested to attend a ceremony at the Ward estate, a wedding. Your bride, Elisa Ward, awaits you. It was a letter he had never expected, a summons for a union he neither wanted nor understood, but there was no avoiding it. He knew the men who had arranged this thing, knew they were the kind of men who made deals behind closed doors and never left room for escape. To say no would be to challenge a group of men who held far too much power in this corner of the world. So Caleb had ridden, and now here he was. The Ward estate lay just beyond the crest of a hill, the sun beginning to sink low and cast long shadows over the landscape. Caleb felt the weight of the earth beneath his boots, the distance between him and the life he had known. His heart was heavy, and yet he had come this far. He had no choice but to go through with it. But when he reached the gates, the sight before him was nothing like he had expected. The estate was grander than any ranch he had ever seen. Stone walls, well-manicured gardens, and horses and carriages lined up like something out of a distant dream. Caleb could hear the sounds of soft music floating through the air, the murmur of voices in conversation, the clinking of glasses. The world here was so different from the one Caleb had lived in for years, so polished, so pristine, so far removed from the dust and sweat of the frontier. He felt like a man out of place. The gates opened with a creak, and Caleb was ushered inside by men in fine suits, their expressions cold, their eyes calculating. They didn't speak to him, didn't need to. They had made it clear that his presence here was not for his pleasure. "Follow us, sir," one of the men said, his voice clipped. The hallways of the estate were lined with paintings and statues, masterpieces of art and wealth. Every inch of the place screamed of old money, of power and status, but Caleb's mind couldn't focus on any of it. His thoughts were on one thing, and one thing only: the woman waiting for him at the altar. He could hear the soft sounds of the ceremony starting, the clicking of shoes on marble floors, the hushed murmurs of the guests, the low hum of expectation in the air. And then, before he even realized it, he was standing before a door, an ornate double door, ready to be opened, and on the other side, the rest of his life awaited him. One of the men opened the door, and Caleb stepped inside, his eyes narrowing instinctively against the brightness of the candles and chandeliers. It was a grand room, adorned with fine silk curtains and velvet chairs. The air was thick with incense, the scent almost suffocating. But it was the woman standing at the altar that caught his attention immediately. Eliza Ward was beautiful in a way that Caleb couldn't quite place. She was the kind of beauty that didn't ask for attention, yet somehow demanded it. She stood there, a vision of grace in a white gown that flowed like liquid, her hair perfectly styled. But it was her eyes that struck him most, the deep, dark brown eyes that seemed to hold so much pain, so much silent sorrow. She wasn't what Caleb had imagined, not by a long shot. She wasn't the radiant bride full of joy and excitement. No, this woman was broken. There was no other word for it. She stood at the altar, as still as a statue, and Caleb wondered if she felt the same weight on her shoulders as he did on his. The priest, an elderly man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looked between them, then at the gathered guests, all of whom were whispering behind their hands. Caleb could feel their eyes on him, their judgment heavy in the air. "Eliza," the priest began, "this is Caleb McKnight. Your husband." She didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't look at him. There was no joy in her eyes. Only resignation. Caleb felt a twinge of sympathy, but it was quickly buried beneath the weight of his own anger and frustration. He wasn't here by choice, and neither was she. They were pawns in a game they had no say in. As the ceremony progressed, Caleb could barely hear the priest's words. His mind raced. He had been forced into this force to marry a woman who wasn't his choice, wasn't anyone's choice. And for what? To satisfy the whims of powerful men who wanted to see him broken. To give him a life sentence of humiliation? At the moment of the vows, Caleb's gaze shifted to Eliza. She looked at him then, finally. Her eyes met his, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Caleb saw something real there. She wasn't just some victim to be pitied. No, there was strength in her. And though she wore that strength like armor, it was clear to Caleb that she had not been given a fair chance at happiness either. "I do," they both said in unison, the words hanging in the air like a heavy burden neither of them could shake off. When the ceremony was over, Caleb felt no joy in the title he'd been given, no pride in the union they'd just formed. He wasn't even sure what it meant anymore, or what it was supposed to mean. All he knew was that this woman, standing beside him, was now a part of his life, whether he liked it or not. Eliza Ward was no more free than he was. The sun hung low in the sky, casting its last golden rays across the vast expanse of the plains. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of dried sagebrush and dust, as Caleb McKnight made his way down the narrow trail leading back to the trading post. The day had been long, filled with the usual routine of checking the outlying fences, tending to the stock, and making sure the post was secure. But the weight of the last few days had been creeping up on him. The weight of the wedding, the weight of Eliza, of his responsibilities. Caleb had hoped that things might feel different after the ceremony. That somehow, after the forced union, after the obligations and constraints of the Ward family's demands, something might change. Between them, he'd hoped for some sign, some spark, that things would shift in a way that would make this unbearable situation more bearable. But Eliza had said nothing. She had barely spoken to him since the ceremony. She had retreated into herself, her silence more damning than any words could have been. Caleb didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to break through the walls she'd built up around herself. But every time he caught her gaze, he saw a flicker of something, anger, fear, maybe even resignation hidden behind the veneer of stoicism she wore. They were both trapped in this marriage, though for different reasons. Caleb hadn't asked for a wife, and Eliza certainly hadn't asked for him. They had both been thrown into a world they hadn't chosen. Caleb's thoughts were interrupted by the low, distant sound of thunder. He paused, looking up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to darken, and the wind picked up in intensity, rushing through the dry grass and sending dust swirling through the air. It wasn't the first time in recent days that Caleb had felt the tension in the air, an odd kind of pressure that hung over the land. It was as if something was coming, something that neither he nor Eliza could avoid. He quickened his pace toward the trading post, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. But there was something about the scene ahead that stopped him in his tracks. The trading post, once a humble but proud little outpost of commerce, was now barely a silhouette against the rapidly darkening sky. The faint glow of flames danced in the distance. At first, Caleb thought it might just be the light of the setting sun reflecting off something metallic or the remnants of a campfire. But then he realized it wasn't the sun, it was fire. A burning, roaring fire. His heart skipped a beat. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, kicking his horse into motion. The closer he got, the more the fire consumed the landscape. It wasn't just a small flame. It was spreading quickly. The trading post, the small stockpile of goods they'd worked so hard to secure, was engulfed in smoke and flames. The acrid smell of burning timber filled the air, thick and choking, as the fire ate away at the wooden structure, crackling and snapping like some wild animal hungry for its kill. Caleb's mind raced. His first thought was to grab Eliza and get as far away from the post as possible. It wasn't safe. The fire was too big, and the dry conditions of the land would only make it worse. But as he approached, he could see movement figures darting between the smoke and flames, carrying something heavy. His instincts kicked in. Whoever was doing this, they weren't just trying to burn the post down, they were looting it. Hell, no, Caleb gritted his teeth, his hand tightening on the reins. The fire might have been out of control, but the people who had set it were still within reach. They weren't getting away with it. He spurred his horse forward, galloping toward the burning structure, eyes scanning the scene for any sign of Eliza. But before he could make it past the fence, something caught his eye, a shadow darting from behind the post, moving fast. It was her, Eliza. His heart caught in his chest. "Eliza!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the fire. She was already there, at the back of the trading post, maneuvering her wheelchair toward the small back door. Caleb had no idea how she was managing, but there she was, moving with purpose despite the chaos around her. "Eliza!" He pushed his horse to the limit, desperate to reach her. She didn't turn to look at him. Her face was set, her gaze focused on something he couldn't see, but she was determined. "What the hell are you doing?" Caleb shouted again, almost enraged. It was one thing for him to run into the fire, but Eliza? She could barely move. Without his help, what in the world was she thinking? She didn't answer him. Instead, she reached out with one hand and pulled open the door to the storehouse, revealing what Caleb had feared, the remaining crates of goods, untouched but in imminent danger of being engulfed in flames. "Get back!" Caleb shouted, but it was too late. He saw her hands, her delicate hands, already moving quickly, trying to save what she could. She was gathering crates, pushing them aside, her fingers trembling as she worked, her breathing sharp. "Eliza, get away from there!" He rushed to her side, throwing himself off his horse and kneeling beside her, his heart in his throat. "I have to save it," she said, her voice tight but calm. "We can't lose everything." Caleb could see the desperation in her eyes, the fire reflected in the depths of them. There was no question in her mind. She wasn't leaving, not without saving what they had left. She might have been bound to that chair, but in this moment, she was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. He grabbed the nearest barrel and pulled it to the side, working with her to move what they could out of the blaze. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick and suffocating. But they worked in tandem, moving the last of their supplies to the edge of the field, away from the flames. And then, just as the last of the crates had been moved, Caleb heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, loud, fast, and coming straight toward them. "Eliza, get to the back." "Now!" Caleb shouted, his voice raw with fear. But Eliza didn't move. "They're here, aren't they?" Her voice was calm, but there was a glint of something in her eyes. Something that spoke of too many nights spent anticipating this very moment. Caleb cursed under his breath, spinning around to face the incoming riders. Buck Harmon. The very name made Caleb's fists clench. He had heard stories of the man's cruelty, stories that made even the bravest men tremble. But now, here he was, riding in with a gang of men who looked as ruthless as their leader. They were here to finish the job. "Damn it," Caleb whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Eliza, go!" Caleb shouted again, his voice breaking through the tension. But Eliza remained steadfast. She hadn't moved an inch. "We don't run anymore, Caleb," she said quietly, the words hanging between them, a challenge in her voice. "We fight." Her gaze was steady, unyielding, and for the first time since the wedding, Caleb saw a flicker of something powerful. In her, a defiance that matched his own. And that was all it took. The days following the fire were filled with hard labor, smoke still thick in the air, and the stinging scent of burnt wood lingering around them like an unshakable ghost. Caleb and Eliza barely spoke to each other, both of them consumed by the work at hand. Yet, despite their exhaustion, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them. The fire had been a brutal reminder of their vulnerability, but it had also been a catalyst for something deeper, something unspoken, but undeniable. Their lives, once defined by survival alone, were beginning to shift. The fire had stolen much from them, but it had also brought them closer together in ways neither could have foreseen. It was a slow process, but they worked in tandem. Caleb, with his broad hands and sheer strength, was the muscle. He lifted and carried, building new walls for the post, mending what had been broken. His body ached, his back sore from the constant toil, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. Eliza, on the other hand, found herself doing what she could, sorting through the salvaged supplies, organizing the new stock, and overseeing the rebuilding of the post. Her mind was sharp, every detail accounted for with precision. She could spot a flawed seam in a wall before Caleb even began to notice it, could calculate the best way to stock the shelves for maximum efficiency. But more than that, she brought something to the table that Caleb hadn't fully understood until now: strategy. When the fire had ravaged their store, Caleb had fought to save what he could. But it was Eliza who had guided his hands, who had suggested which items to prioritize, which crates to move first, and which tools to salvage. It was Eliza who had seen the bigger picture, the one that Caleb had been too consumed by the fire to even imagine. Now, as they rebuilt, it became increasingly clear that their partnership, whether by fate or by necessity, was something more than either of them had anticipated. As they worked late into the evening, their shoulders and backs aching, Caleb looked at Eliza in a way he hadn't before. There was a quiet strength in her, something that radiated from within her, a strength he'd underestimated when they first met. She wasn't just a woman who had been cast aside by the world. She was sharp, calculating, and more than capable of holding her own. The old Caleb, the man he once was, before the betrayal and the broken trust, might have seen her as a burden. But the man he was now, broken, humbled, and desperate to rebuild, saw her as a force. "Eliza," he said one evening as they worked side by side, his voice gruff, "you've got a mind for this. You ever consider running a business of your own?" Eliza glanced up at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in her eyes. "I'm running it now, aren't I?" she said simply. Caleb looked away, unsure how to respond to that. She was right. They were running this place together, even if neither of them had formally agreed to it. But that fact hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken, yet clear. She'd turned the tables somehow. It was then that Caleb realized just how much he had been taking her for granted. Despite the fact that she was confined to a chair, bound by her injury, she had more control over the direction of their lives than he did. She had a vision, a clarity that he had lost along the way, somewhere in the ruins of his past. That night, after they had finished for the day, Eliza sat in the small chair near the fire while Caleb moved around the post, checking on things. The fire crackled, its warmth a strange comfort as they sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. "How's the inventory looking?" Caleb finally asked, hoping to break the tension that had settled between them. "Better than before," Eliza replied. "But we're going to need more supplies if we're going to make this work. We've still got a lot of ground to cover. Then we'll go out and get it," Caleb said, glancing over at her. "Where?" "Not out of this yet." Eliza's lips pressed together in a thin line, but there was something almost resolute in the way she said, "We will be." She wasn't just talking about the business, Caleb realized. She was talking about them, about their lives, about their future. She was determined to make this work, to make something out of the mess they had been handed. And for the first time, Caleb understood. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something more, a rebirth. Over the next few weeks, their routine became increasingly intertwined. Caleb would go out to handle the more physical tasks, cutting timber, gathering resources, and Eliza would oversee the business side, managing the accounts, making sure that every transaction was recorded with meticulous care. Their bond was growing stronger, and though it remained unspoken, there was a deep sense of trust developing between them. The townspeople, too, began to take notice. Whispers about their success and about Eliza's uncanny ability to read the market spread. Quickly, it wasn't long before Caleb noticed a change in the way people treated them. They were no longer just two broken souls scraping by. They were becoming something else. A symbol. It was one evening, as Caleb sat on the porch of the trading post, that the true weight of what they had accomplished hit him. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the land, and the breeze was just cool enough to be a welcome relief from the day's heat. He could hear the distant sounds of horses' hooves, of travelers making their way toward the post. It wasn't unusual to see people passing through, but tonight, there was something different. A wagon appeared on the horizon, drawn by two sturdy horses. The wheels creaked as they rolled along the rough trail, kicking up clouds of dust behind them. Caleb stood, instinctively reaching for his rifle, though there was no real reason to be alarmed. Still, something about the way the wagon approached made him uneasy. Eliza, noticing his stance, called out to him. "Don't shoot them, Caleb." "I'm not going to shoot them," he replied, though there was a tension in his voice. "But you might want to be on guard." Eliza wheeled herself toward him, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm always on guard." The wagon rolled to a stop just outside the post, and Caleb recognized the driver immediately, a grizzled old man named Luther, who had been passing through the area for years. He had a reputation for being a straightforward trader, but Caleb had learned the hard way to be cautious around everyone. Luther climbed down from the wagon and tipped his hat. "Evenin', folks," he said gruffly. "I heard word that you two are turning this place around." "We're doing what we can," Caleb replied, trying to hide the wariness in his voice. He stepped closer, studying the wagon. It was loaded with supplies, and though there was no sign of trouble yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a routine visit. Eliza gave a polite nod. "We're making it work." Luther's eyes flickered to her, and Caleb noticed the respect there, respect for her, not just for the post. "You're a sharp one, Missy," he said. "I've been hearing the buzz. Folks in the area are starting to pay attention." Eliza raised an eyebrow, a small confident smile playing on her lips. "I'm sure they are." The conversation continued, but Caleb's thoughts kept drifting. What had begun as a simple partnership, an agreement born out of necessity, was slowly evolving into something much larger. It was more than just the business now. They were changing the dynamics of the frontier, and the people who had once looked down on them were starting to take notice. And that, Caleb thought, might be the most dangerous part of all. The weeks following their progress brought a cautious sense of hope to Caleb and Eliza. The trading post, which had been nothing more than a smoldering ruin not long ago, was now an oasis of new beginnings. Caleb's hands had worked themselves, raw, his muscles aching at the end of every long day, but the satisfaction of seeing something rise from the ashes, something that had been theirs, was worth every ounce of effort. Eliza, too, had thrown herself into the work, calculating, strategizing, and managing every facet of the post with a precision that astounded even Caleb. For the first time in a long while, they had started to feel like they had a chance. They were no longer the broken, discarded people they'd once been. They were partners united in purpose and vision. And perhaps, just maybe, they were becoming something more than just survivors. They were becoming a force. But as the days grew longer and their lives more settled, a shadow from Caleb's past was beginning to creep ever closer. It was a late afternoon when the news reached them. It wasn't much at first, just a simple rider passing through the post on his way west, a grizzled man who had known Caleb in another life. His name was Harper, and Caleb had been avoiding him for years. Harper's news was as brief as it was chilling. "Edgar Blackwell's back in town," Harper had said, his eyes darting around nervously as he leaned against a wooden beam. "He's got a gang with him, looks like he's been up to something. Ain't good, Caleb, might be looking for you." The name hit Caleb like a bullet to the chest. Edgar Blackwell, an old rival, a man whose face he had tried to forget. Blackwell had been the reason Caleb had been forced to leave his old life behind. The reason he had become the man he was today, a broken cowboy, running from his past, from his mistakes. And now, Blackwell was back with a vengeance. "Are you sure?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. It didn't matter if Harper had been exaggerating. When it came to Edgar Blackwell, the truth was always worse than the rumors. "I don't know much, just what I heard on the wind," Harper muttered. "But he's dangerous, Caleb. Always was. You best watch your back." Caleb didn't say another word. He just watched the man leave, his mind racing. Eliza, who had been in the back of the post, came out and saw the expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice cautious but steady. Caleb shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. "Edgar Blackwell's back. And he's looking for me." Eliza's expression hardened. The man she had come to know wasn't one to back down easily, but even she knew the weight that name carried. "Is he someone you owe?" she asked, her gaze intense. Caleb hesitated. "More than that. He's the reason I left everything behind in the first place. And the reason I'm here." She studied him for a long moment, sensing the hidden layers of pain beneath his words. But then her resolve solidified. "If he's coming for you, we'll face it together." Her statement wasn't just one of sympathy, it was a promise. And for the first time, Caleb realized that she wasn't just offering her support. She was offering her strength. She was standing with him, not because she felt sorry for him, but because she knew what they were building here. She believed in it, in them. "I can't let you get caught up in this," Caleb muttered, his voice thick with a mix of guilt and shame. "I've been running from this for years. It's not your fight." Eliza's eyes never wavered from his. "It's our fight now, Caleb. Whatever comes, we face it together." And in that moment, Caleb knew there was no going back. He'd been running from his past for too long, hiding behind the lies he told himself. But Eliza was right. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. A few days later, the tension in the air was palpable. Caleb had known Blackwell for too long to believe that he would simply walk in, shake hands, and make amends. No, Blackwell didn't operate that way. If he was coming, it was because he had a score to settle, and settle it he would. It wasn't. Long before the first sign of trouble arrived, just as Caleb had expected, the unmistakable sound of galloping horses echoed through the prairie. Caleb's instincts kicked in before he even saw the riders. He was already halfway to the trading post door, rifle in hand, when Eliza called out to him. "Caleb, wait." He stopped and turned to see her wheeling herself toward him, a determined look in her eyes. "You don't need to do this," she said quietly. "You don't need to face him alone." Caleb hesitated. He had never wanted to bring Eliza into the dangers of his past. But now, standing there with her, seeing the fire in her eyes, he realized something. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. "It's not just about me anymore," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "It's about us. And I'm not running from him anymore. I'll stand my ground, whatever it takes." Eliza nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we'll stand together." The sound of horses grew louder, and soon enough, the riders appeared on the horizon, 3 of them, with Blackwell at their head. The tall, imposing figure was unmistakable, even from a distance. Edgar Blackwell had always been a man who exuded power. His tall frame, dark hair slicked back, and icy gaze were enough to make anyone think twice before crossing him. He rode into view, his eyes locking with Caleb's from across the dusty street. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Caleb," Blackwell's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I didn't expect to find you here of all places. But I suppose it makes sense. You've always been good at running, haven't you?" Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. He wanted to see what Blackwell was after, what kind of game he was playing this time. "I'm not running anymore, Edgar," Caleb said, his voice colder than the wind that swept across the prairie. "What do you want?" Blackwell's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only malice. "You owe me, Caleb. You've always known it. I gave you a chance to walk away with your life, and you threw it all away." Eliza, sitting resolutely beside Caleb, didn't flinch. She stared directly at Blackwell, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've been holding onto that grudge for years," she said, her voice surprisingly calm but firm. "Maybe it's time to let it go." Blackwell's gaze flickered toward her, then back to Caleb. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, but he said nothing. "We'll see how long you hold on to that grudge," Blackwell finally said, his tone colder than before. "But make no mistake, Caleb, this isn't over." As Blackwell turned his horse to leave, Caleb felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. He had stood his ground, but the true battle was still to come. Edgar wasn't done with him. He would never be done. Caleb watched as the riders disappeared into the distance, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. The confrontation had been brief, but it had made one thing abundantly clear. The past had come to claim him. And this time, there would be no running. Back inside the post, Eliza didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. She rolled beside Caleb, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Neither spoke for a long while, both of them consumed by the knowledge that the storm was just beginning. The days after Blackwell's visit dragged on like a thunderstorm building on the horizon, its rumblings faint but undeniable. Caleb and Eliza had steeled themselves, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. While Caleb had hoped to avoid further conflict with Blackwell, the grim reality of their situation made it clear. The past would not leave them in peace. Trading Post had become a symbol of something new, a beacon of hope in the harsh frontier, and it seemed that there were those who were eager to extinguish that light. Caleb had never been a man of grand ambitions, but he had fought hard to carve out a life from the unforgiving land alongside Eliza. Now that hard-won life was under threat once again. For days, Caleb's instincts told him that trouble was brewing. He could feel it in the air. The tension was palpable, as if the wind itself carried whispers of something darker, something inevitable. And yet, despite his preparations, he was caught off guard when the first attack came. It was just before dawn when the attack started. Caleb had been sleeping lightly, the weight of his past keeping him from ever truly resting. He woke to the distant sound of hooves, too many, too fast, and too close. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle beside him, but he already knew that the time for waiting was over. The danger had arrived, and it was coming for them. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice hoarse as he shook her awake. She stirred, blinking in confusion before the fear in his eyes registered. Without a word, she wheeled herself to the door, her mind already shifting into survival mode. By the time the first wave of attackers came into view, Caleb had already taken his position. Outside, hidden behind the wooden structure of the post. He could see them now, the black silhouettes of horsemen, their faces obscured by the haze of the early morning light. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more. And leading them, Caleb didn't have to guess. Blackwell. Caleb's grip tightened around his rifle as he squinted into the distance. There was no mistaking it now. Blackwell had come for him, and this was his first strike. "What the hell do you want, Blackwell?" Caleb called out, his voice cutting through the stillness of the morning air. The attackers didn't respond immediately. Instead, they circled, their movements deliberate, methodical, as though this were a game to them. From the center of the circle, Blackwell's voice rang out, smooth and cold. "I want what's mine, Caleb. Always have. And now you're going to pay for what you took from me." Caleb's jaw clenched. "You've taken enough. You've always taken from everyone around you." Blackwell's laugh was like the sound of metal scraping against stone. "You really think you're something different, don't you? A man on the run, hiding out here with this woman you've tied yourself to. You think you can outrun the past? You think the law's going to save you?" His tone turned venomous. "You've got a debt, and it's time to settle it." Eliza, now beside Caleb, readied herself, her hand resting on the grip of the rifle that had become as much a part of her as her own hands. She hadn't spoken, but her presence beside Caleb was enough. She knew what Blackwell was capable of. She knew the kind of man he was, and she wasn't about to let him tear apart what they had built. "We're not afraid of you, Blackwell," Eliza said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You may think you can intimidate us, but you're wrong." The riders shifted, eyes narrowing as they took note of her, her courage sparking a flicker of doubt in some of them. Caleb could feel the tension in the air, thick and brittle. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was a battle for the future. Blackwell's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "I'm not here to negotiate, sweetheart. You can hide behind your little trading post all you want, but this land's mine. And I'm here to take what's owed to me." The outlaws moved forward, and Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle. This was it. This was the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating all at once. The first shot rang out without warning, a crack in the silence that shattered the stillness of the prairie. Caleb wasn't sure who fired first, but the sharp ringing sound of gunfire echoed across the field. He ducked, instinctively pulling Eliza out of harm's way as bullets sliced through the air around them. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline rushing through his veins. The fight had come faster than he'd anticipated, and the stakes were higher than ever. He couldn't afford to lose this. Eliza was already moving, steady and calm, her rifle aimed with deadly precision. She fired in one smooth motion, taking down one of Blackwell's men before he had the chance to react. It was an impossible shot, a testament to the quiet strength that Eliza had cultivated in the weeks they'd spent together. Caleb's admiration for her swelled. She wasn't just a partner in name, she was a force in her own right. The outlaws hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or retreat. Caleb saw his chance. He took aim, firing once, twice, and then 3 times, each shot finding its mark. One of Blackwell's men fell to the ground with a cry. Another cursed as he clutched his shoulder, his weapon slipping from his grasp. But even in the chaos, Blackwell remained cool, his eyes never leaving Caleb. He raised his hand, signaling for his men to hold their ground. "Get them, boys," Blackwell sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Don't let them run." The gunfire intensified, and the standoff became a full-blown battle. Caleb and Eliza moved with practiced precision, firing when they needed, to ducking and dodging when they had to. There was no room for hesitation, no room for second chances. It wasn't long before the tables began to turn. The outlaws, though dangerous, were disorganized. Caleb's years of experience in combat had taught him how to read a fight, how to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies. And now, with Eliza by his side, they were a formidable team. As the fight raged on, Caleb caught sight of Blackwell again, his face twisted in fury. The man was dangerous, calculated, ruthless, but he was also human, and humans made mistakes. Caleb didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot, and this time, it was a direct hit. Blackwell staggered back, his hand gripping his chest as he gasped for air. For a moment, it seemed as if the world itself had stopped. Caleb could hear his own breath, the pounding of his heart in his ears, but the silence was short-lived. Blackwell's men faltered. The sight of their leader wounded was enough to shake their resolve. One by one, they began to retreat, turning their horses around and racing back toward the hills. The sound of hooves pounding the earth grew fainter, as Blackwell's men abandoned their mission. With Blackwell down and the outlaws fleeing, the battle seemed to come to an abrupt end. But the victory was bittersweet. Caleb stood there, rifle in hand, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He glanced over at Eliza, who was still calm, her eyes sharp, scanning the horizon for any other threats. "You all right?" Caleb asked, his voice strained. Eliza nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We're fine, we survived." "And so did you." But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Blackwell would come again, and next time, he would be prepared. This wasn't the last they'd see of him. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the prairie, Caleb and Eliza stood side by side, surveying the battlefield. They had fought for their survival, for their future, and they had won. But the scars of the day were already beginning to show the emotional weight, the realization that they couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding forever. "Let's get to work," Caleb said quietly, turning back toward the trading post. Eliza nodded, her expression resolute. Together. And in that moment, as they walked back toward their home, Caleb knew one thing for certain. They were not just surviving anymore. They were fighting for their future, for each other, and for a life they could build together. But whatever lay ahead, Caleb wasn't running anymore. The days that followed the skirmish with Blackwell's men were heavy with the aftermath. The adrenaline from the fight had worn off, leaving behind an exhausted, aching sense of relief. Caleb and Eliza had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. There was still too much uncertainty, too much unfinished business. The morning after the battle, the sun rose in a sky streaked with fiery red and orange, but its warmth didn't reach Caleb's bones. As he stood in the doorway of the trading post, watching the horizon, his thoughts were tangled in knots. He couldn't help but feel that this brief lull in violence was only temporary. Blackwell was still out there, and he would be back stronger, angrier, and more determined than ever. But for now, there was work to be done. Caleb walked toward the edge of the property where the remains of the gunfight had left its mark. The prairie was littered with the bodies of Blackwell's men, their horses grazing a short distance away, confused by the abrupt shift in the tension that had once filled the air. It felt surreal, like the calm after a storm, where you could hear the rustling of leaves but knew the wind was only gathering strength for another gust. Caleb pushed those thoughts aside. For now, they had to survive. Eliza was already hard at work. She had been busy ever since the gunfire had ceased, going about the tedious but necessary tasks that followed any kind of battle, making sure their ammunition was restocked, checking the perimeter for any signs of danger, and tending to their weapons. She looked up when Caleb approached, her expression serious, though there was a quiet relief in her eyes. "We need to bury the bodies," she said softly, her tone steady. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, it's the right thing to do." Eliza's gaze shifted toward the group of horses grazing nearby. "The animals need to be tended to as well. We can't leave them out there like this." They worked together in silence, each lost in their thoughts, but the rhythm of their movements was familiar, cooperative, synchronized. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. They had been through enough for words to feel unnecessary. They knew what needed to be done. They had always known. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the bodies of Blackwell's men had been buried, and the horses were fed and watered. The trading post, though still standing, had a somber air about it. The memory of the violence from that morning hung over them like a dark cloud, a reminder that their lives could be upended. In an instant, Caleb found himself sitting on a crate outside, elbows on his knees, staring out at the vast expanse of the prairie. The peace they had fought for was fragile, too fragile. Eliza came up beside him, a cup of coffee in her hand. "You all right?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Caleb glanced up at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, just thinking." "You always think too much." Eliza handed him the cup. He took it, grateful for the warmth. "It's not over." "I know, but we made it through today. That has to count for something." He took a sip of the coffee, its bitterness grounding him. "It does, but Blackwell isn't the only problem we've got. There are people out there who see what we're building here, Eliza. They're not going to let us keep it." Eliza's gaze hardened. "We didn't get this far to just give it up." "That's true," Caleb agreed. "But we need to be ready for anything." "I know. We will be," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "We can't run anymore. We've made a life here, a good life, and I'm not letting anyone take that from us." Her words filled Caleb with a sense of quiet pride. It was true. They had fought for this place. They had fought for each other. They had built something solid, and nothing, not Blackwell, not anyone, was going to take that from them without a fight. The next few days passed slowly. Each one was filled with work repairing the damage from the attack, ensuring the trading post was secure, restocking supplies. Caleb and Eliza had become a well-oiled machine, their routines syncing as if they had been living like this for years instead of just months. Despite the lingering threat of Blackwell, the work itself was a distraction, a way for them to keep their focus on the present rather than the future. But the future always loomed. One morning, as Caleb and Eliza were making their rounds, checking the perimeter of the property, a figure appeared on the horizon riding hard, dust trailing behind him as he approached. Caleb's heart rate picked up. There was something familiar about the way the man rode, the urgency in his movements. "Who is that?" Eliza asked, her hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over her shoulder. Caleb squinted into the distance, trying to make out the rider's face. "I don't know. But they're coming in fast." The man rode closer, and Caleb's hand went to the rifle at his side. But before he could act, the rider was upon them. "Caleb, Eliza." The man's voice cracked with urgency. "It's Blackwell. He's coming. With more men." Caleb's stomach tightened. "How many?" "At least 20, maybe more. They've been gathering on the other side of the ridge. I barely made it out in time. You've got to get ready. He's not coming alone this time." The riders. Words hit Caleb like a hammer. There was no more time for preparation. The storm was here. Eliza's eyes met Caleb's, and for a moment, they both understood the weight of what was coming. The battle with Blackwell had only been the beginning. The fight for their lives, truly for their lives, was about to become a much larger, much more dangerous conflict. "We need to fortify the post," Caleb said, his voice tight with determination. "I'll get the rifles," Eliza said, already moving toward the barn. "You start with the barricades." Without another word, they sprang into action, their movements swift, practiced, as if they were anticipating the chaos that was about to unfold. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And in the distance, Caleb could already hear the faint sound of hooves. The storm had come, and this time, it wasn't just the wind that would bring destruction. It was Blackwell and his men. And they would not stop until everything Caleb and Eliza had fought for was turned to ash. As the day stretched on, the heat of the sun beat down on the smoldering remnants of the battle, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to the earth, as though even the land was wary of what had just transpired. Caleb and Eliza worked in silence, the gravity of their situation settling over them like the dust kicked up by their enemy's retreat. The trading post, their home, was still standing, but Caleb knew the reprieve would be brief. There would be no peace for them, not until Blackwell was defeated once and for all. "Eliza," Caleb said, his voice low, almost hesitant. She didn't look at him immediately, her attention focused on checking the rifles they'd left behind. After the fight, but she could hear the weight in his tone. "I know," she said, meeting his eyes. "I'm not blind, Caleb. I can see what this is. They'll be back. We can't hide here forever." Her words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. Caleb had always known, deep down, that their survival wasn't guaranteed. But hearing it from Eliza, someone who had fought just as hard as he had, who had stood beside him in battle, made the truth all the more undeniable. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about standing firm against everything that sought to tear them apart. Their fight had just begun. "We can't just keep defending ourselves forever," Caleb sighed, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They'll wear us down eventually." "We'll find a way," Eliza replied firmly. "We have to." She wheeled herself over to the stables, where the horses were still agitated from the chaos. Caleb followed, but his mind was elsewhere. As much as he hated it, he knew Eliza was right. If they stayed here, they'd be easy targets for Blackwell. Their best option now was to take the fight to him, to go on the offensive before he could rally more men. But how? How could they stand up to Blackwell and his network of thugs when it seemed like the whole world was working against them? "I'll take the horses out to the west," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Get some distance. The land out there is wide open, but it's also dangerous. We can't stay here. Not with Blackwell getting stronger." "Are you suggesting we run?" Eliza's voice was sharp, though there was an edge of concern in it. "No," Caleb said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm not suggesting we run. I'm saying we need to get ahead of this. We need to scout, figure out what we're up against." Eliza didn't speak right away. Her eyes flickered toward the burning horizon, as if looking for answers in the fading light. Finally, she nodded. "I'll get the supplies together. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared." They worked swiftly, moving with a precision that had come from months of surviving together. Caleb saddled the horses while Eliza packed what they would need: water, food, medical supplies, and ammunition. It wasn't the first time they'd had to prepare for an uncertain journey, but the weight of this particular mission hung heavy. They weren't just preparing for a quick run or escape this time. They were preparing for a fight that could end everything they had built. After they'd finished packing, Eliza looked at Caleb, her gaze unwavering. "You know this is bigger than just us, don't you?" Caleb nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, it's bigger than Blackwell even. If he's coming after us, he'll do it to anyone who stands in his way. We can't just fight for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for every man and woman who's ever had their life torn apart by men like him." Eliza met his gaze, her expression fierce. "Then let's make sure he knows we won't back down." The decision was made. They weren't going to run. They weren't going to hide. They would face Blackwell head-on, and they would make sure that when this was all over, there would be no more doubts about who owned this land. The journey to Blackwell's stronghold was long and grueling. The path Caleb and Eliza took was unfamiliar, winding through treacherous terrain, the kind of land few dared to traverse. With every step they took, the sense of urgency grew. Caleb could feel it in the way the wind swept across the prairie, whispering through the tall grasses and scattering dust in the air. They weren't just running to escape. They were running toward the reckoning that awaited them. Eliza rode alongside him, her hands gripping the reins of her horse with determination. It was the first time she'd been able to travel in this way since her accident, and despite the hardship, there was a certain freedom in the open air, the wide, endless horizon stretching before them. As they neared the outskirts of Blackwell's territory, the signs of human life grew fewer and farther between. They were no longer in the heart of civilization. This was the edge of the frontier, where only the strongest survived. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking Blackwell's stronghold, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the darkening landscape. Caleb stopped, signaling to Eliza to pull her horse up beside him. They dismounted quietly, their boots crunching on the dry ground as they made their way to a concealed position, carefully surveying the compound below. Blackwell's stronghold was more of a fortress than a home, a sprawling compound surrounded by high wooden walls and a network of guards. From this vantage point, Caleb could see the movement of men patrolling the perimeter, rifles slung across their backs, their eyes scanning the surrounding land for any signs of trouble. "Looks like Blackwell preparing for something," Caleb muttered, his eyes narrowing. He's not alone anymore. Eliza's eyes darted over the scene, her expression unreadable. "No, he's not. And neither are we." For a moment, they stood in silence, taking in the sight. It was clear now that Blackwell wasn't just a local bully. He was building an empire, a network of influence that extended beyond the trading post. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were up against a man who wanted to control the entire region, to crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. "We can't take them all on by ourselves," Caleb said, his voice low, but resolute. "We'll need help." Eliza nodded. "We already have help. It's not just us anymore, Caleb. We've built something. We've built a community, and they're not going to let us fall without a fight." The weight of her words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. She was right. They weren't alone. And as long as they had each other and the people who believed in what they stood for, there was hope. It was time to take the fight to Blackwell. And this time, there would be no running. The battle for the future was about to begin. But Caleb and Eliza weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for everything they had built, everything they had fought for, and they would make sure that Blackwell's reign of terror ended once and for all. As the darkness crept in around them, Caleb and Eliza prepared for the fight of their lives. And this time, they would make sure that when the dust settled, the future would belong to them. Together, the night seemed to stretch longer than usual, each minute pulling at Caleb's nerves as he and Eliza crouched low behind the rocky outcrop, the wind carrying the scent of dust and sweat. The soft rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of nocturnal animals did little to ease the tension. Between them, they were too close to Blackwell's stronghold now, and every instinct told Caleb that the next few days would be their most dangerous yet. "I hate waiting," Caleb muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the shadows below. "It feels like every minute is another step toward disaster." Eliza's fingers brushed against her rifle, a comforting gesture in the stillness of the night. "I know, but the best plans don't come from rushing in blindly." Patience. Caleb gave a short nod but couldn't bring himself to agree. Patience had never been his strong suit, especially when it came to Blackwell. But Eliza was right. They needed a strategy. The stronghold loomed ahead, an intimidating presence in the night. Blackwell's compound wasn't just a fort, it was a symbol of his ambition, his hunger for power. What had once been a simple ranching outpost had been transformed into a small fortress. High wooden walls, watchtowers, and a network of armed men patrolling the perimeter. Every detail spoke of the man who now owned this land, who had made it his kingdom. "We need to know everything," Caleb said softly. "Every weakness, every patrol route. We can't go in half-cocked." He glanced at Eliza. "You're sure the people back at the trading post can hold up their end if we go through with this?" Eliza's lips tightened, her gaze steady as she looked toward the distant lights of the stronghold. "We'll need to draw his men away from the compound. The folks back home can create a distraction. Give us the opening we need." She hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing. "But Caleb, we can't keep risking this. The longer we stay, the more danger we're in. If this doesn't work, we'll have no way out." Caleb knew the truth of her words all too well. They'd already gambled a lot on this mission, too much perhaps, but there was no turning back now. The fire had already been set, and the only thing left to do was to watch it burn. "Then we make sure it works," Caleb said, voice steady, though his gut churned with uncertainty. They spent the rest of the night preparing, mapping out Blackwell's stronghold, marking the patrols they'd spotted, and gathering the supplies they'd need for what was to come. The plan was simple enough. Create a diversion at the trading post to draw Blackwell's men out, then infiltrate the compound, locate Blackwell, and finish what they had started. But as the moon climbed higher in the sky, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. By the time dawn crept across the horizon, the world seemed quieter, as though the land itself had settled into the uneasy peace that always came before a storm. The morning of reckoning arrived with a quiet intensity. Caleb and Eliza moved swiftly through the underbrush, the chill of the dawn still lingering in the air. The land was rugged, the terrain uneven, but their focus was unyielding. They didn't speak much. There was no need for words between them now. The silence was enough. The weight of what they were about to do hung heavy in the air. When they reached the western edge of Blackwell's stronghold, Caleb motioned for Eliza to stop. They crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, eyes fixed on the compound. The first rays of sunlight bathed the wooden walls in an eerie golden glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like dark fingers. Eliza's rifle was ready in her hands, her gaze sharp. "We'll need to move fast. Once the distraction's made, we won't have much time before Blackwell's men return." Caleb nodded. "Then let's make sure we don't waste it." They had no choice but to trust their plan. It had been designed with precision, each piece a calculated move, but no plan survived first contact with the enemy. Caleb knew that better than anyone. Still, they had no other choice. At the trading post, the signal was given. The dust kicked up by the hooves of their horses had barely settled when the first explosion rocked the earth. Caleb's heart skipped in his chest at the sound, the loud crack of gunfire and the thundering boom of a firecracker. The distraction had begun. Caleb didn't wait for the full effect. He and Eliza moved quickly, darting between the boulders and trees that would take them closer to the compound. From the looks of things, Blackwell's men had been drawn to the chaos. Caleb had done his best to predict their movements, and the fact that so many of them were rushing toward the distraction was a good sign. Still, they couldn't afford to waste time. The stronghold was now almost entirely unguarded, save for a few scattered men still lingering on the periphery. It was an opening. "Now," Caleb whispered, his voice low but urgent. Together, they moved into position. The infiltration wasn't as easy as it seemed. Once they neared the walls of the compound, Caleb and Eliza split up, taking different routes to avoid being seen. The fortress was more complex than Caleb had anticipated, with guards stationed in every possible blind spot. Their training paid off as they quietly neutralized the few that remained, using their skills in stealth and precision to take out the threats one by one. The silence of their movements was almost eerie, each step calculated, each breath measured. Caleb's mind raced as he made his way through the compound. He had come this far, but the closer he got to Blackwell, the more anxious he felt. This man, the one who had turned his life upside down, who had chased him across the land, who had torn apart everything Caleb had fought to build, was just beyond reach. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of carefully navigating the stronghold's interior, Caleb found himself outside the large, dimly lit building at the center of the compound. Blackwell's quarters. He motioned to Eliza, who was silently working her way toward him. Together, they made their way to the door, weapons drawn. The final confrontation was near. When Caleb and Eliza entered the building, they found Blackwell sitting at a table, his back turned. He was alone, something that surprised Caleb, but he didn't hesitate. "Blackwell," Caleb called out, his voice like ice. The man didn't flinch, though his posture stiffened. Slowly, he turned in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Well, if it isn't Caleb," Blackwell said, his tone smooth but cold. "And the little woman who's managed to keep you alive." Eliza didn't flinch at the insult, her rifle steady in her hands. "We've come to end this, Blackwell," Caleb said, his voice low and filled with finality. "Once and for all." Blackwell stood, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me?" He laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You've already cost me more than I care to count. And now you're going to pay for it." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle, but he didn't fire. Not yet. "Everything ends here, Blackwell." And it would. They would make sure of it. The standoff in the dimly lit room seemed to stretch into eternity. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears. The only sound louder than the beating of his heart was the quiet shuffle of his breath. His rifle was trained on Blackwell, but the man seemed unaffected by the weight of the moment. He stood tall, as though he had all the time in the world to watch Caleb and Eliza squirm before him. "I've been waiting for this day," Blackwell said, his voice calm, even with a hint of amusement, as though he were enjoying the show. "I knew you'd come. You always do, don't you? Always poking your head where it doesn't belong. Always looking for a fight." Eliza didn't say anything. Her grip on her rifle was unshakable, but her eyes burned with a quiet rage that mirrored Caleb's own. They weren't here to talk, not anymore. They were here to finish what had begun. Caleb's voice broke through the silence, low and threatening. "You've made a lot of enemies, Blackwell, and the only thing left for you now is to face the consequences." The corner of Blackwell's mouth twitched upward in a sardonic smile. He took a slow step toward them, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Consequences? You think I haven't faced consequences? That my empire has come this far without a few bloodstains? You're as naive as they come, Caleb. This world doesn't work by rules, not by any moral code. It works by power. And right now, I hold all the power." Caleb's fingers twitched. It was hard not to pull the trigger then, but something held him back. It was too easy, too quick. He wanted more than just Blackwell's death. He wanted him to understand that no one, not even a man like him, could escape justice forever. "You've destroyed enough lives to fill 100 graves, Blackwell," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "And it's time you dug your own." For a moment, Blackwell's expression faltered, just for a second, as if a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. But it was gone before it could settle. He glanced around the room, as though considering his options, before his gaze met Caleb's. Again, you think you can stop me? You're too late. Too little, too late. Blackwell's voice was laced with venom. I've already won, Caleb. The land is mine, the people are mine, and soon all of this. He gestured vaguely to the room. To the stronghold surrounding them, will be my kingdom. A kingdom built on blood, yes, but it's a kingdom nonetheless. Caleb took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes not leaving Blackwell for an instant. The man might have built an empire, but it was one born of cruelty and fear. And now it was crumbling, piece by piece, as Caleb and Eliza stood in the center of it. You're wrong, Eliza spoke, her voice sharp. This land isn't yours, Blackwell. It never was, and it never will be. The words hit Blackwell like a slap. His eyes narrowed. For the first time, there was no mockery in his expression, just pure, unbridled fury. He lunged. It happened so fast that Caleb barely had time to react. Blackwell was quicker than he expected, his hand reaching for a concealed knife. In one fluid motion, Blackwell threw himself toward Caleb, the blade flashing in the dim light. But Caleb was ready. He sidestepped the attack with a quick, practiced movement, bringing the butt of his rifle down hard on Blackwell's arm, knocking the knife from his grip. Not so fast, Caleb growled. Blackwell stumbled back, momentarily stunned. The rage in his eyes intensified as he scrambled to regain his footing. But he was off balance now, his arrogance replaced with raw anger. You're making a mistake, Caleb, Blackwell spat, rubbing his wrist where the rifle had struck him. You think this is just about you and me? You're a fool. I have allies everywhere. The moment you take me down, they'll come for you. For both of you. Eliza stepped forward, her rifle still steady in her hands. Then let them come. Before Caleb could react, Blackwell lunged again, this time with a desperate, frantic fury. But this time, Eliza was faster. Without hesitation, she fired a warning shot near his feet. The sound of the bullet ricocheting off the stone floor was deafening. Blackwell froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're not the only one with an army, Eliza said coldly, her voice unwavering. The look of realization crossed Blackwell's face, but it was too late. His arrogance had blinded him. He had underestimated them. Caleb and Eliza had never been alone in this fight, not really. They had the community behind them, the people who had stood with them through every trial and hardship. And that Blackwell could never take from them. Get on your knees, Caleb ordered, his voice harsh. It's over. For a long, tense moment, Blackwell didn't move. His pride, his power, his entire life built on violence and domination fought against the reality of the situation. But slowly, as if the weight of his own downfall had finally sunk in, he sank to his knees. His shoulders slumped. I had the world at my feet, Blackwell muttered, his voice small now. I had it all. And you lost it, Caleb said. Flatly, just like everything else you've ever taken. The silence between them stretched, heavy and full of finality. Blackwell knew it as well as Caleb did. There was no escaping it now. The aftermath. The sun was beginning to set when Caleb and Eliza walked out of Blackwell's compound, their footsteps echoing in the eerie quiet. Blackwell was gone, his reign had ended, and the land that had suffered under his rule was free. Once more, as they approached the edge of the compound, Eliza glanced at Caleb, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she finally spoke. We did it, she said, her voice soft, but tinged with exhaustion. Caleb nodded, though there was no triumph in his face. We did, but we're not finished yet. Eliza arched an eyebrow. What do you mean? The land is ours now, but there's work to do. We have to rebuild. We have to make sure that what Blackwell built doesn't rise again. This time, it's not just about surviving, it's about living. Living the way it was meant to be. Eliza smiled, a rare, genuine smile that warmed Caleb's heart. Then let's get to it. And together, they rode off into the setting sun. ready to face whatever came next, because this was only the beginning. If you're captivated by America's past, the untamed Wild West, or inspiring tales of faith, redemption, and love, then you're in for a treat. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to Big Bites and Brews for more legendary frontier stories.